Good afternoon and welcome to the latest event in our week of VocTech celebration here at UFI. I'm delighted to be the chair of the session this afternoon, focusing on the investment landscape in VocTech right now. I'm Alex Bishop, our investment manager at Ufi Ventures, and we're really excited about the session this afternoon, hoping it can be a really insightful hour for everyone who's given up some of their time. We are focusing in today on all things investing in the VocTech market right now, hoping to pull out some of the key trends we're seeing as investors and entrepreneurs in the market, the macro environment we are operating in, the long-term outlook as well for investing in the space, as well as how you align impact and finance in investing too. So it should be a really interesting hour. Just before we introduce the great set of panelists we have for this discussion today, just a bit of housekeeping. Really keen for this to be as collaborative a session as possible, and would love for comments and questions to come in on the right-hand side of the screen. I will do my best to moderate that and pull in questions for our great set of panelists as we go along, and we'd be really keen for it to be a collaborative approach. Also, if you're planning on doing anything on social throughout the session, we'd love for you to include a hashtag week of VocTech to emphasize what we're doing at UFI. Without further ado, I'd love to bring in all the panelists, and what we will do is we'll bring them in one by one and ask them to give a bit of an introduction to themselves. Firstly, I'm delighted to be joined by one of our own, Helen Geroni, long-term investor and venture partner at UFI. Hi, Helen.
Hi, Alex. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me. So I have a background of 20 years of investing in early stage businesses. A lot of them in the education space, adult learning space. I've been an investment director at Nesta, a fund called the Capital Fund, another fund called Ufi Ventures, and now I'm a venture partner for several funds. And I'm a non-exec director on 2 UFI portfolio businesses. So Learnably, which is a marketplace for workplace learning, and Learning Labs, which goes into schools, colleges, and the workplace to teach English as an additional language.
Great to have you here, Helen. I'm really excited about the conversation to come over the next hour. Next up, we are joined by Nick Kind, Managing Director at Titan Partners, to give some of the later stage insight into the conversation. Hi, Nick.
Hi, good afternoon, Alex, Helen, and everyone. Really nice to be here. Bit of background. Titan Partners, as many of you may well know, is an investment bank and strategy consultancy laser focused on the education and human capital management markets. We do very little else around the world. My background is that I spent 16 years developing educational software, including co-founding a .com back in 1999, before moving into strategy and corporate development. And I now advise companies, foundations, investors, and other sorts of organizations across the education space, but I have a particular focus on impact investment, VocTech, and the future of work.
Thanks, Nick. That's great. Our third panelist today brings a really great insight from a worker tech perspective and an early investment perspective too. Delighted to be joined by Louise Marston, Director of Ventures at Resolution Foundation. Hi, Louise.
Hi, Alex. Thank you for having me on the panel today. I'm Louise Marston. I lead the social investment and ventures work at the Resolution Foundation, which is a think tank which is focused on improving living standards for those on low to middle incomes. Our investment work focuses on worker tech, as Alex said, so looking for ventures who are using technology to improve low paid and precarious work in different ways, including through training and skills, but also through developing worker power and worker voice in different ways. Before joining the Resolution Foundation, I've worked in ventures and in policy work around innovation and responsible technology at Burnham Chalcott and Nesta, and more recently Everyone.
Thanks, Louise. And finally, our final panelist today is Mikhail from Sonic Jobs, CEO of Sonic Jobs, and could give his perspective from a founder's side. Hi, Mikhail.
Hi, Alex. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Sonic Jobs. We've built technology which brings together the jobs ecosystem. So instead of redirecting candidates to career sites, candidates can apply for any job on our website or on our app itself. We have over 1 million jobs candidates on our platform and over 300,000 applications per month. So every 9 seconds, someone applies for a job through Sonic Jobs. We've just launched in the US and we've raised 5.5 million in total in venture capital.
Thanks, Mikhail. I'm not sure about all of you, but I'm really excited about the next sort of 55 minutes. I think we're going to have a great conversation. I know as part of the kind of the framing for the conversation and when we've been broadcasting this out to the community was around, off the back of the pandemic, do we think that venture investing in tech for adult skills has now come of age? And I'd love for some of the audience as well to comment on this, and I'm going to go around the panel, starting with Helen for your perspectives on that as a framing question.
Brilliant, thanks, Alex. It's a really interesting question. I think we've seen enormous change and activity in the adult skills sector, particularly recently during the pandemic. So a huge transition to online working 100% as workers became more remote. I think we've seen not all ventures make it, but those that have squeezed a huge amount of innovation into a short space of time, probably aided by a more forgiving client base. So I think we've ended up with a wide selection of really intelligent tools that companies and users can use, many of which were there before, previously around, but have been finessed and tailored more during the pandemic. But the real step change, I think, is that we now have a really receptive and engaged audience of users and client base who want to train their workforce, who want to use these tools to engage with them, to retain employees, to attract new employees in a really, really competitive employment market. So it's that uplift in users, I think, that has made ventures in this space more financeable. And we've seen some really interesting transactions happening in the financing space. Lots of them, or rather lots of larger deals, fewer smaller deals. So I wonder whether there is a bit of a funding gap emerging there at the earlier stage. But generally a huge amount of transition and a really exciting space to be involved in now.
Yeah, I think that acceleration piece is really interesting. And Mikhail, I'd be interested to hear your perspective on this from the other side of the table.
Yeah, just to kind of elaborate on that acceleration point, I think what's very clear, at least to me, post the pandemic, is that our entire edtech, VocTech space is changing completely, and I think that the opportunity is, I think we're just at the start of this journey, and actually the opportunity going forward is enormous. I think about kind of offline and online coming together. I think about jobs and learning coming together. I think about kind of the new jobs. I think something like coding will become a bit like math, science, English across every school, across the world at a really early age. And so I think we're just starting that journey. So, I mean, I guess kind of spoiler alert to my view on our entire question, which is, I not at all, has investing in digital technology in the edtech space or VocTech space come of age. I think we've just got, we're at the very start, and I think you'll see hundreds of unicorns built in this space, well, definitely in Europe, and then definitely across the world over the next, I would say 5 years, even as little as 5 years, and I think there's a huge opportunity there.
No, I think that's really interesting, Mikhail, as an opportunity, but also your perspectives on some of those technical skills that could become way more mainstream. We were talking to Capslot, one of our portfolio companies, yesterday, and they're a cybersecurity school, but all about making that easier to get into those kind of skills and access to those kind of skills. So I think it's very interesting. Louise, I'd love to hear your perspectives on the question from your side.
Yeah, I thought, given representing the Resolution Foundation, which does a lot of research on the labour market and the outlook for jobs and skills, just what we're seeing at the moment, which is we were expecting early in the pandemic for unemployment to be a huge problem at this point in time, and we're not seeing that coming through. And the data that's come out even today and this week has shown that actually unemployment's in reasonably good shape, and that coming off the back of the furlough scheme, which has only just ended, we're actually not seeing the huge levels of unemployment we thought might be potentially possible. But we have seen a lot bigger numbers in education and moving into inactive and not looking for jobs than we have seen previously. So that sort of suggests that what Mikhail and Helen were saying about this being a kind of inflection point or the start of a new area of growth is probably true. We've got a lot of things to address in terms of people potential to transition between sectors and to move out of education and out of inactivity into jobs. So I think there's lots of unanswered questions there and lots of potential for growth on the back of these big changes in practice that Helen was highlighting.
Yeah, it's super exciting. And, I think we did a lot of work earlier in the year around reskilling and upskilling and the potential for that as an opportunity. And I think that lends itself to that, what you were just saying, Louise. Nick, wrapping us all up from this framing question, interested to hear your perspectives.
Yeah, and little to add, if you like, with a UK perspective to what my fellow panelists have said. But I think I'd say one additional thing, which is I would argue that it's coming of age. And I think this is partly what Mikhail was saying, particularly relative to what's happened in the United States. So, one of the reasons why I find this whole space so interesting is I spend a lot of time looking at, if you like, the workforce and corporate learning and VocTech in ecosystem in the US, which was very, very mature considerably before the pandemic. Dedicated funds, foundations really playing an interest with initiatives. We worked on things like the Employment Technology Fund and so on. And I think that specialism and interest is now starting to emerge here in Europe and across the European continent. So I think we're coming of age in that sense, but I don't think we're quite as mature yet as our colleagues across the Atlantic.
Yeah, Nick, just coming back on that though, do you think off the back of the pandemic and some of the growth in key trends around sort of the adoption of digital technologies, do you think that has changed the investment landscape and moved things more, accelerated it more? What are your perspectives on that?
I mean, look, definitely. And I think a couple of things have happened across this. I mean, first of all, people have realized what's possible with digital, but they've also realized what's hard. And I think that's really important. We and many people across the country and indeed across the world have experienced online learning in its various forms, both delightful and less than delightful. It needs to be done well, and I think everybody's realizing that. And I often make the distinction between online learning and emergency remote teaching. And regrettably, we saw quite a lot of emergency remote teaching, and I think it made people realize what good online learning can and should be. And as I say, I think we've worked out what's hard, and hard in all sorts of different ways. I mean, clearly there are some types of learning that even now it's very, very difficult to deliver purely digitally, whether that's teamwork, what used to be called soft skills, what now is called perhaps the 5 C's, things like that. And indeed, anything that involves physical manipulation. I'm not sure I'd trust a plumber who'd been trained entirely virtually, I have to say. One of the other things that I think that we've discovered is it's just all about motivation and agency. It's really quite difficult, even for somebody who is, feeling self-confident, in the right place, has got all the technology to sit there and engage with online learning. It's much, much harder for the underserved and folks who aren't in that good place. And I think that's a really interesting but difficult set of challenges for us to solve. And I think just the other thing that it's made people question, and I think that this is important, is how much is this the end of classroom learning? And I've given all that I've said just now, I don't think it is, but I think it might be the end of the junket for corporate learning, if that makes sense. There are some underlying trends that make the landscape the same. Happy to talk about those, Alex, as well. Big tech is doubling down on this space. That had happened before. There's market consolidation happening, perhaps accelerated, but that was present previously. And there's a lot of money in the market. And I think we're going to talk about this in a minute. So I'd say a couple of things in conclusion to answer your question. I mean, I think there is still a lot of interesting spaces, a lot of really interesting spaces for venture investment to look at around the landscape, in the UK, in Europe more broadly. I'm interested in connectors, people who are bringing together disparate tech systems. Microsoft wants everybody to use Teams and Viva, but people are still going to use Slack and Atlassian and all sorts of other things all over the place. Who's the glue? And niches in content, niches in geography, niches in sector, niches in algorithms are all super interesting. And finally, really interesting thought that I think I keep debating a lot, and we've talked about a little bit before jointly and severally, is about for VocTech really to work, particularly in learning, we need to see some really credible digital pathways emerge. And I think they need to be credible both to accreditors and to employers and to the employees themselves. And where that's going to emerge, we're not quite there yet, but people can see that possibility afresh, but we haven't quite got there yet.
I think that's a really interesting point, in the sense that with more digital solutions being embedded into this as a sector, and the inherent scalability that digital solutions allow from an investment and a funding standpoint, do we think that from an investor's perspective, does that make it a more desirable place to put your money? Helen, I'd be interested to hear your perspectives on that.
Oh, definitely. I think it does. And also doing things digitally, I think, allows you to reduce your cost base in ways that, we might not have anticipated. And I'm thinking of sort of online tutoring and being able to access tutors on a global scale, so time differences aren't an issue, and your cost comes down. I think what I'm sort of grappling with at the moment is how this applies to impactful work in this space. And how much money can be made in this area. There's a lot of fantastic impact that happens, but there's less of it that happens at a huge scale, which is what funders are interested in. And I think that's a big challenge, aligning the right business models with the right funders to make sure that impact happens at scale.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be something we're going to cover in depth when we discuss around impact and finance, and how they can join together, off the back of some of the 100% impact discussion that happened on Monday. Mikhail, I'd love to hear your perspectives on that, on the sort of the growth of digital from a founder side.
Yeah, I'm gonna contradict Nick slightly, just for the discussion in particular. But it depends how we define coming of age, because I think it depends how we define of age in particular. I think, but one thing I would kind of say from a founder perspective, and by the way, I am an optimist, but I wouldn't do what I do if I wasn't. I think a lot of things that are hard today are not hard tomorrow. And so what I mean by that is, let's take the expression kind of, I wouldn't trust a plumber trained digitally. Now that's true today, like that's 100% true today, except that we have VR, we have AR, like augmented reality. We're training pilots today, right? So you would you've got a pilot that could be trained tomorrow entirely digitally, entirely through VR. Why couldn't your plumber be trained entirely digitally tomorrow? And I think that the other aspect of this is kind of empathy, which is kind of again, particularly when you look at kind of people really in need, long-term unemployed, people who need to get their skills back up. Today digitally you can't do that. It's really hard. You need a lot more hand-holding. You need a lot more attention per person. And I would say, today we can't. Tomorrow, what does that look like? If I think about something like shopping, again, quite different vertical, but people weren't comfortable yesterday. As if we look just 5, 7, 10 years ago, putting their credit card online, shopping online. There wasn't this idea that, and now a lot of people prefer shopping online. You've got a much more engaging experience online. And so I think, I'm sure we could debate that. I think probably the language of coming of age or come of age is the key to this. But I just think, I genuinely think we could 10x the amount of investment in this space today in Western Europe, probably 100x it globally, and we would still, on average, every investor would make money. Let's assume every investor wants to make 10x return. You could 10x the amount of investment, and every investor would still, on average, get a 10x return on that, because I really think it's kind of at a nascent stage, but I'm sure Nick will respond. Yeah.
Look, I don't entirely disagree, Mikhail. Right? And I mean, really, I mean, my brief reflection on that is being a great investor in this space is finding that point at which tech, pedagogy, possibility, and return converge. And we're all making judgments on where that be. I agree that the possibilities are enormous. When that possibility is ready enough is really the crucial question. And I speak as a founder of a .com in 1999 who basically called the market far too early. So I guess I bear some scars from that, and so my optimism is a little bit moderated, and it's all about judging that moment. But I don't disagree with your broader point.
Great. I'm glad we reached some resolution on that. Just moving, I think some of what Mikhail was covering off around kind of the trend of when we will inherently at some point we will see digital training as the same as putting your card in online shopping. I think that's where it's going. I think it's really exciting. Just taking it back a little bit, there's obviously, I think Nick alluded to, there's a lot of capital flooded in the market right now, and that's no different in the VocTech space. We've seen a huge amount of capital being coming in. Obviously, valuations are increasing and round sizes are growing up. Do we think, though, that investment is going into the solutions that can actually positively impact the most learners in need, or is it just going to the organizations that would have already been funded in the first place? Louise, I'd be interested to hear your perspective from like an earlier stage investor on that question.
Yes. So, I mean, calling whether things would have got funded anyway, it's like, if we knew that, then so many things would be easier. But yeah, from the point of view of an impact investor, our primary focus is looking for things at quite an early stage that have got potential to really grow in size so they can impact hundreds and thousands and millions of people. And the drives of that, from a technology point of view, are you've got better information or better quality. So things Mikhail was talking about in terms of things you can see the hints of today, but making those things better, making them more accessible, making them easier to use. Or you can connect people together. So we're talking about one-to-one tutoring. So technology can provide connection between people at a remote distance. And sometimes that's done well, and sometimes that's done badly. But if you can do that at scale, again, there's potential for really huge impact, because lots of the things we know that make learning good and make it important are about connection, about relationships, about motivation, all of those things. So technology can be helpful in these things if it's deployed in the right way. But I think the thing we really look at in terms of whether this is going to have the greatest impact for those who need it the most, we're talking about people coming out of unemployment and other kind of barriers to getting back into better jobs, is how you get started in the first place. So you can provide a great solution for people that has lots of improvements over alternative methods. But if you can't get people on there in the first place, and you're just delivering that solution to people who would have come to a similar type of quality of solution through another route, then you can't have the maximum impact. So one of the things we pay real attention to is, how are people finding these things in the first place? What's the referral route? What's the introduction route? How do you get over some of these barriers of motivation and confidence that the UFI white paper last year outlined? And which of these solutions have got ways of addressing those issues and getting people started in a way that kind of gets them into this journey in the first place? And then you can be really effective with some of these technology tools.
Yeah, I think that thing around removing barriers and increasing accessibility to technologies that can enhance learner experiences is vital. And, I think we see that as a critical thing when we're investing, is how accessible can this piece of tech be for learners that might have fallen outside the labour market or stuff. And we're seeing a lot of stuff going on in that space, which is really exciting. Nick, I'd love to hear, again, later stage perspectives from you on that point.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to build a little bit on what Louise had to say there. I mean, I think there are two potential challenges about this money reaching places which can really solve some of the problems of those who don't have advantages and privileges in society. I think the first one is exactly what Louise just said. But I am going to channel a little bit of Mikhail here, just to be clear. There are wicked problems that can't be solved at scale by technology yet. That was the Mikhail bit, right? So, you know, and I think that discoverability and motivation piece that Louise was talking about, I think is really crucial and important in this whole thing. And I would love to see, but I haven't seen, you know, a technical solution that does that at scale yet. And again, I don't know if Helen would agree from her long investing experience, but I think there's also just sometimes something about what I call the shape of the business or the shape of the organization. You know, some businesses do grow like that. You know, they are venture shaped. You know, they will get to Mikhail's 10x, but some aren't. Some are shaped like that, or some are shaped like that. And for those businesses, you know, venture investing or indeed private equity investing and late stage investing just isn't appropriate, because the rules of the game are such that these people want a certain IRR on their money. And whilst there are concessionary investors, and you know, there are emerging concessionary investors, you know, Louise is doing really interesting work in this space. There are plenty of other people doing really interesting work in this space. You know, we haven't got as many here in Europe or in the UK as I've seen in America. So I think that there's this interesting issue about the shape of money and where it goes. Louise.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Nick, on terms of the different business models have different profiles here, and that suits different sorts of investors. I would say another thing on the, is this reaching the right people? It depends slightly on who's paying for this training. And we know that, you know, we produced a report at the Resolution Foundation on the outlook for British firms in the next decade, kind of thinking about British firms and productivity. And one of the long-standing problems in kind of UK firms on average is lack of investment in management skills and in other parts of training and skills. You know, we've had an underfunded sector in FE for a long time. So if we're going to reach some of the groups of people that need this the most, there's also a question of where does that money come from? How do we demonstrate the returns to kind of skills and training in a way that helps recycle that money? But how do we kind of lift the sources of capital? Because if it's just people paying for their own skills training, then that's always going to benefit a different profile of learner than it is when we're looking at the groups we really want to create impact for.
Just keen to bring Helen in on this from your investment experience, Helen, on the perspective of kind of aligning impact with funding.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I mean, I think there's one particular model that works quite well, and that's where you have a business that's selling to underserved, underprivileged community alongside other individuals as well, and that's a sort of model that works quite well in terms of scaling. So you have a slightly different model. So I'm thinking of, you know, thinking back to the online tutoring business, going into education establishments in the UK and selling to individuals who are underprivileged and falling behind. So using government funding to achieve those revenues, combined with going out to homes direct to consumer in the UK and worldwide and providing exactly the same service, but that's paid for by families, by individuals, and it's exactly the same service. But by doing that, you are achieving a scale that brings down the cost overall for everybody, and there's no sort of discernment, there's no difference between what everybody's receiving, but it's just funded in a slightly different way.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. I know Mikhail's keen to jump in, I think.
Yeah, I think it's some super valid points, and I agree with all of it. The analogy I would give, or the way I think about it, is that it's a bit like if you were a green energy investor, I'm going to say like 10 years ago, right? So if you're a green energy investor 10 years ago, Tesla would have looked like a really poor impact investment because it only did high-end cars, and they were basically people buying effectively green Alfa Romeos, right? Which was what, you know, branded as Tesla, and it could go like, I don't know, I think it was 10 miles or 20 miles or whatever. And that's kind of where I think about like where we are today. And by the way, you could do more impact at that point in green energy by investing in like a local, like you know, sort of tradesman who was kind of putting in solar panels on people's roofs, right? That was more impactful than what Tesla was doing 10 years ago in terms of impact, right? For sure. And then you see kind of over time where suddenly people are buying Teslas as their first cars, and then now you've got this green car revolution. You've got government and car makers coming together, like in London, and then kind of zoning out different things. You've got kind of the bike solutions coming in. You've got kind of a real kind of enhancement in that. And I think about it in the same way today. The impact solutions look like that. It's the ones that are big and have scaled are not making as much impact as if you were going and you could invest in a youth center with 10 people and actually make a bigger difference to their lives than some of the kind of impact investments per se, who are making a small amount of difference to each person's life rather than a big amount of difference to one person's life. But I think that changes. I think that curve moves. I think you get more into mainstream. The hardest sector to go into, a bit like green energy, is kind of the lowest income market. When does the lowest income car buyer buy a green vehicle? That's the last stage. But I do think of it as a curve, and I think we're just kind of starting that. We're 10 years behind green energy, but we'll get there.
I agree on that perspective, that it's there definitely is more focus in the VocTech or adult skills as a function for investors to come in and drive social impact. And there's a really interesting questions come in the chat around what do we think would influence when you're out fundraising, or actually when you're deploying capital as a VC to invest into companies to drive social impact. Coming back to that question about financially driven investing versus socially impacted or environmentally impacted investing, what do we think? How do we drive that to be more of a narrative within the funding conversation? It primarily focused on the adult skills market.
I'm happy to respond to that one. I mean, look, I think there's a really important point here, which sometimes gets lost in some of these discussions, and which honestly many venture capital firms don't own up to, which is that venture capital is a product. Venture capital has been sold to a group of investors who are what are called their limited partners or their LPs. So the people whose minds need to be changed in this discussion are actually the LPs, who have a view on what success of a fund looks like. And there are some really, really interesting people who are thinking very, very hard about this, both in the US and Europe. It's that needs to change. It's that about, knowing that you can go to an LP as a venture fund and saying, what, we're going to have this return and measure these in impact, and people demanding that as much as it's anything else. Because the VCs have agreed with those LPs a very clear set of terms of reference about what they're going to invest in. Just picking up on a point we had earlier from Helen, some investors are very, very nervous of government funding because they see it as mercurial, as unpredictable, as subject to the political cycle. There was an example in Australia a few years ago when the nature of vocational funding in Australia changed very, very quickly. And a lot of people got their lost money and got themselves very burned. So my answer to your question, which is very interesting, Majinda, is think about those people who are investing in those funds. And insofar as you have power, people in this room have power, we're all investing in pensions. We all may have ISAs. Think about where that money is going. What pressure are you putting on the people who are managing your money to make that happen?
No, really interesting. And I'm keen to. I think the conversation in the chat is starting to build, and lots of questions. So we'll come back to some of those later on in the afternoon. One thing I think would be interesting to touch on that we haven't kind of discussed yet is around kind of the macro environment we're investing in right now is unusual. There's a lot of cash in them as well. We're seeing a disconnect between the vacancies we're seeing in the labour market and job seekers looking for work. How do we as investors and entrepreneurs manage that solution? How do we mitigate that and carry on operating and investing in the space when you're seeing such disconnect between the two things? Louise, I'd love to hear your perspectives on that first.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I'd say from a labour market perspective is that some of those disconnects between vacancies and jobs is temporary, is an effect of reopening. We are still reopening the economy. The furlough scheme only is just finished. So there's still, for the UK perspective, there's still a kind of a churn effect from just reopening the jobs market, lots of people coming back into it. And so some of that is shorter term and resolve. Some of the sector-specific, skill-specific gaps that we've been seeing and been so reported have their origins quite a long time back and have been there as problems in individual sectors for some time, but it's only just now with a combination of different types of pressure that they've really come to light and become much more consumer stories, things around construction, around HGV drivers. Those are kind of long-standing problems that are a combination of demographic factors, migration, skills and training factors, all sorts of things coming together. And it just happens that they've surfaced now to get more attention. So some of those, I think, are trends that are worth paying attention to. Particularly in terms of kind of people's career aspirations and where people are going to and what things people are choosing to be trained into. So I think that those are worth paying attention to, but some of those are shorter term things which will move out. But I think there is some longer term things about digital skills in the broadest sense of being able to navigate a digital world of work that leads to lots of different implications about how people find jobs, get them, what sort of skills they're asked to use while they're in work, whether they're using sitting at a desk or not, and then kind of how we kind of manage what the gap is between people's awareness of where the demand is and where people are actually looking for jobs. So what we saw through the pandemic was that people who came out of the hospitality sector either on furlough or unemployment were going back to look for jobs in the same sector they knew already, despite the fact that that was one of the sectors with the lowest vacancy rate at the point they were looking. So giving people ways in which they can understand how those skills might translate into other sectors is worth paying attention to, because that's one of the things it's really hard to do right now, where technology and better information can provide a really important piece.
Yeah, and I add testament to that. We're seeing so much innovation in that space you just alluded to, Louise, in terms of trying to help people really. Mikhail can add to this as well, with what Sonic do, but really trying to help people realize what skills are relatable to other roles and other industries. I think that's a really exciting space to be looking at the moment. Nick, I know you were keen to jump in on this as well.
I would just say very briefly, interested in particularly if Helen agrees, but that what Louise has just outlined should be an opportunity. I mean, there's clear value creation there. Somebody is getting paid and somebody is getting hired. And if you can find the right solutions, that should be a clear commercial opportunity for an entrepreneur. That's exactly the sort of place where we should be looking for interesting investments.
I totally agree, Nick. I really do. I think that there are very defined skills gaps within the UK. To Louise's points, yes, some temporary, but some more permanent that have been built up over many, many years. So, for example, I think companies struggle to find, people with the softer skills to employ, that kind of thing. And it's all about being aware of it, signposting, and removing or reducing the financial barriers to individuals training in those areas. So like Capstock is doing, reducing the financial barriers to training. This needs to happen on a much greater scale. And I think there will be companies stepping into this space because it is a huge area of opportunity.
Yeah, I completely agree, and it's very, very interesting. And Mikhail, from your perspective, love to hear from your side of on this.
Yeah, I fully concur with everything that's just been said. Actually, I think I guess just at a broader level, I think we have all historically kind of had one career or one sector that we focused on, and I think that will totally change. So, to Louise's point around hospitality workers going back to hospitality, we see that as well in terms of kind of candidates coming in and out of furlough on Sonic Jobs. I think there's a huge opportunity and we believe there's a huge opportunity to create combining learning and jobs, and specifically almost combining learning where you're not knowing or thinking about learning. Learning has become, or is this kind of thing that, oh, I'm going to learn. That's just not how young people do their continuous learning anymore. I think there's, we think about this kind of almost TikTok for learning, for want of a, I'm sure there's a better phrase for it, but you know, where you're almost unconsciously learning. And I think there's a huge opportunity, particularly in the younger sector, or in the younger market around that. But totally concur with what everyone's said.
Yeah, I think that's, again, really interesting, Mikhail, around kind of, you know, how do young people learn? And I think community-based learning is quite an interesting thing for that. And a lot of organizations we look at are really focusing in on that as like a mechanism that you learn off other people, and that's kind of really trying to grow that narrative and community side of things. Going back to the chat, keen to keep the conversation open. We've had a question from Denise around what are some of the best examples of VocTech Ventures tracking employment outcomes such as salary and progression. Is this more challenging for digital and traditional training programs, or not anymore? I'd be interested to maybe come to you on that, Nick, from your perspective.
Yeah, and thanks for that question, Denise. There are plenty of good examples of this, and I mean, sadly, in many ways, the good examples are those where they are in some ways obliged to for regulatory or accreditation reasons. You know, we're seeing a lot of debate about this going on in the US right now. There's a whole debate around what's called gainful employment going on in terms of people who are emerging from university, particularly for profit universities. So there are some really great examples of people doing this. I've seen companies, you know, looking at salaries, looking at, you know, whether or not people have progressed. It's onerous to gather that kind of information sometimes. You know, you might have to do surveys, you might have to ask companies to instrument what they're doing, but there are ways of doing it, and that's quite interesting. And I think it's something that, you know, investors can think hard about in terms of how they hold some of their investee companies accountable. And again, coming back to that LP point, things that LPs might ask for. I don't think it is more challenging. To answer the second part of your question, I don't think it is more challenging for digital than traditional training programs. And indeed, I would argue it should be easier. You know, there should be a whole bunch of touch points that you've got with that person. You know where to find them, you know, even after they've gone through your training program. And indeed, if you're an organization that's thinking about, to use a horrible investor term, customer lifetime value, you want to be making sure that you have contact with that person and indeed understanding where they're going and what their trajectory is. So I don't think it should be more traditional for digital providers at all, although I'd love to hear why you think it might be if you want to slot that in the chat and respond. But that would be my brief take on that question. Again, don't know if anyone else has a perspective.
Yes, Denise, please do come back. We're really wanting this to be as collaborative as we possibly can be. Louise, I'd love to hear your perspective from the earlier side of things.
Yeah, I was just echoing on that from Nick's points there. I think there are ways in which it's easier for digital. So some of the really interesting examples we've seen are of people who are trying to create a platform, to Mikhail's point around learning in a different way, you know, seeking it as a continuous process of engaging people through learning, recruitment, then progression into new jobs, and so keeping track of people over a longer period of time. They're trying to create platforms that are engaging enough that you stick with them, and so they can keep track of those progression and evidence over time. So I'm hoping that we see some really good evidence in those areas. But I think there are some challenges, because when it's a sort of continuous process, some of the things that we've done in the past with sort of adults learning and surveys is to try and separate out which types of learning have most value in terms of future employment and skills. And that tends to be quite clunky definitions between a degree or a full-time learning occupation or a classroom-based and things like that. And when those boundaries become more blurred, it's going to be harder to attribute certain types of progression to any given intervention if you're doing continuously a whole bunch of different things. So I think there's reasons for there's going to be easier, and actually reasons to make it actually in some ways more complicated.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question, and you know, I think it's all comes down to sort of digital sides will probably drive scalability and make it easier to track that data. You know, take the caps lock example again, their employment outcomes are embedded within the organization. that's a lot easier for them to do that at a couple of hundred learners than it is 1,000 learners, and that data point becomes a lot more complex. But obviously, because they're a digital first organisation, it does have some advantages. Right, I appreciate we've flown through 48 minutes without me even realising. I thought we were about 20 minutes in. But, really excited to I think it's been a great conversation. I know we've got a few more questions in the chat that I'll probably come to at the end. But just, in summarising, I don't want to come back to the first question, but in a sense, I do want to come back to the first question off the back of what we've discussed. What does, Mikhail's been talking about this is a long-term thing and things are he sees it as an upward curve. What does the long-term outlook look like for investing in this sector, off the back of the pandemic and everything that's accelerated? And what do you think still needs to take place for us to get to where we think that VocTech has come of age? And Mikhail, I'd love to start with you first because you had some great views on this earlier on.
Yeah, I think as a broader point, and just addressing also Maureen's question on the chat, I think in general, businesses and ecosystems, and I think of VocTech, EdTech, move in curves. They don't move in lines. And what I mean by that is, I think it's important that for me, or the way I think about it, I think we need to understand that at the kind of start of this curve, and I'm there have been other curves, and we obviously kind of come along since a little bit of time, but there's a long way, and I think that then helps the entire ecosystem navigate the conversation. And so I think of it as, that means that impact investors and also EdTech investors understand that, that there's a long way to go. That means that kind of government comes in. That means that more founders are engaged. I think, again, looking at the green, or thinking about the green example, Tesla forced the other manufacturers to become green, and then so every car now is being produced as more and more hybrid, more and more green, that sort of stuff. And you couldn't have predicted that when Tesla first made their Alfa Romeo. That's just not possible. If you're going to ask Tesla when they made their first Alfa Romeo, what happens in 12 months? That's not a very interesting question, and that doesn't answer what you're trying to build. But if you ask what's going to happen in 5 years, that's a really interesting question. And then I think I think as we look forward, I think there's what I think will happen next is more and more investors in the space, more and more founders in the space, more and more collaboration between government and private. At least that's what I hope will happen.
Great. No, I think that comparison you've made is really interesting. I think that's going to add a lot of kind of understanding to it in terms of where we are in comparison to a more developed impact space that's kind of probably ahead of us. Helen, I'd love to hear your perspective as a broader investor in this, and from bringing that perspective as well as kind of your sector specific with the work you do at UFI, and what you think the long-term outlook is for the sector of VocTech.
I think it's hugely exciting. I think the next 5 years particularly are going to be very exciting. What I'd love to see happen is some really good exits for companies in this sector in Europe, just so investors know that you can make money here. And I know you can, but it's great to have the evidence, because that's what you need to get investors attracted. I think early stage businesses, we've got some great technology, some great solutions. So we need money to go into those early stage businesses. We need engaged angels and early stage funds to invest in that end of the market. And I think what we also need is sort of joined up thinking, lots of signposting, whether that's government or other institutions, to make people and companies aware of the skills gaps and what can be done, so that innovation can be targeted where it needs to be targeted.
Great. I think echo that more needs to be done, kind of just echoing the challenge. And that's why weeks like this week, when we're trying to really voice all the great work UFI does, is really crucial for us. Nick, I'd love to come to you on your perspectives long term for the market.
I echo and build on a great deal of what Helen just said. I'm super excited about this whole space. I spend a lot of time thinking about it, and love spending a lot of time thinking about it. I think it's the second biggest problem we have to solve after the climate, and I really feel that it's vitally important. I think, just building again on Helen, I think it's not just about exits, though those are very important. It's about really telling the story of how and why this is an investable space to people. Because sometimes, and you know, we've had this experience, I've had this personal experience in the last few weeks of them going, what do you mean you can invest in that? And it's like, no, this is why. And we've got to perhaps as a community find some really compelling, quick ways of telling that story about the fact that this is a place where you can invest and you can make money and make a difference, and finding really good, almost heuristics for doing that. And we're just at the beginning of doing that, I think. And I think also, just again, to your point slightly, just, you know, somehow governments across Europe need to understand the really interesting potential for innovation, what the possibilities are. You know, channeling my inner Mikhail here, you know, this could be enormously exciting with the possibilities of technology. So those are the things I would say.
And finally, you know, keen to come to you, Louise, for your perspectives on it.
Well, I don't think we'd be here if we weren't optimists. We wouldn't be investing in this space if we weren't optimists about its potential. So, yeah, I absolutely echo all of that. I think there's lots of underexplored potential, particularly the sectors we're looking at: low wage work, precarious work, those who are in a more sort of semi-skilled manual jobs. Technology just hasn't been used enough in those sectors to transform the way that people work and the way that people learn. And so there's loads of underexplored potential there. I'd agree with Nick that, you know, after the climate, this is a really big underexplored area of potential. I think the things we need to see, I think I'd echo some of the things we've already said, but also we want to see a bit more British business investment into skills. I think that lots of elements of the pandemic have highlighted the importance of that. And I think when we're talking about different ways of investing in capital and infrastructure and all the other things, skills and training is such an important element of that. And, you know, and government investment as well into skills and training and the kind of the long promised lifelong learning ideas need to come through, but not just investment, connection points. So how do we join some of these pieces together so that people who find themselves in a job that they don't want to be doing, who want to retrain, who want to move into a different sector, have got a starting point for that conversation, have got a connection between some of the different providers and some of the government touch points to help people kind of navigate those journeys.
That's, yeah, completely agree. It's really, I'm just looking at some of the comments just to see kind of where we're at, and it would be great to just, I think, go back onto a couple of those before we wrap up. But, you know, I completely echo. I think we're all very positive on the outlook for VocTech investing, adult skills for work investing. I think from my perspective, you know, it's about how do we fund the right things and show the tangible benefits that can be made in this market. That's one of the reasons we as a fund exist, is to try and catalyze and demonstrate, you know, that money can be made in this space. So I think it's a really exciting space to be. Just looking at some of the comments, I think there was a question just around that Rebecca asked about coming back to what we've just been discussing, and we might have just covered it off, but any more deeper thoughts on how do we, and to Nick's point around how this all works with LPs, how do we tangibly demonstrate to LPs that you can make that VocTech investing can be an attractive investment opportunity? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that, Nick. This is one of the questions. Go a bit deeper on that.
Yeah, I mean, tell stories.
Yeah.
And there are emerging stories in this space. And that in the US, there have been stories for some considerable time. In Europe, they're just starting really to emerge and get traction. I mean, you know, whether it's obviously the great success that Multiverse has had, you know, originally, I believe, a UFI grantee, you know, has had in raising really substantial funding rounds, you know, mirrored perhaps a bit like by a company like Open Classrooms out of France. You know, there are some, you know, French companies being bought. There are real stories we can now start to tell. And I think that's what's really important about it. And you know, we have to make those public and accessible and celebrate that success. And indeed, you know, where we can celebrate not just their financial success, which is often what gets the headlines, you know, 60, 80 million funding rounds, you know, everybody gets very excited and it hits the FT. You know, what about celebrating also the differences that they've made? I think both of those things together would be a really interesting thing to look at.
Mikhail, I'd love to hear your perspective from the other side on this one.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add to Nick's point, actually, that I think in India and China, India as well, I'm from originally, like I actually think in the edtech space, they're telling the story much better than we are here today, or in the UK today. It's all about how do you educate, re-educate 1 billion people. That's the story in India, that's the story in China. And yeah, we don't have 1 billion people in the UK, but I think we have just as much of a change to be made, right? So I think it's a different story. It's more about how do you reskill, re-educate. How do you get businesses to be leaders in the world? How do you get kind of British businesses to really kind of excel? How do you get kind of more people training and being part of different segments, etc. But open classrooms is a great example. I think that there's just a different story to be told. But I just want to add that I think we probably just need to be less British about it, and I think we just need to kind of tell the story enthusiastically and kind of in the future we believe in, because across the world they're doing that and doing that very successfully.
Great. I think we've got a few minutes left. Any perspectives on that question from Helen or Louise before we finish up?
I just wonder how much of this story is about, as a sort of culture, as a country, how much emphasis we place on education. I mean, I know EdTech, for example, in China has been so successful, partly because people really value education there. And maybe that's why we've been sort of slower to celebrate the successes and have experienced these successes in the adult skills sector and EdTech generally.
And I think we probably take education for granted here, like in the UK, because it's part, in China and India, they don't take education for granted. And so then that kind of leads to that. But I think yes, it's just that re-emphasis that I think I agree.
I was just going to build on the idea of telling stories. I think that one of the things that happens, at least in the US really well, is telling place-based stories. So it's telling stories about cities and regions and communities where there are lots of different pieces of the puzzle coming together. There's the businesses working with the training providers, working with different digital tools. And I think we could do a lot more of that in the UK. We could look at those kind of ecosystems that happen at a local level, which translate local demand for skills into solutions that can kind of help fill those gaps. And I think that's an area where we could be conveying the benefits and people be able to see more tangibly what the kind of how all these things link together.
Great. The hour has flown by in no time at all. And, I think that's been a really interesting conversation. We've covered off so many topics and, I think we could discuss this for hours. In fact, we have discussed this for hours. So, really appreciate all the panel's time and for the audience being so kind of engaged in this. As you'll know, this is available on demand post, it will go up on our website. We also have some more content tomorrow, so please keep a lookout for that. This has been a great week celebrating all the things we do in UFI, and it's great to be a part of it. But special thanks to all the panelists that have taken place, guys. Really appreciate it, and to all the audience, have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you very much.